Buenos días. Gracias a todos por venir hoy. Yo soy Sheena Iyengar. Estoy aquí para hablarles de la decisión de elegir. So, my Spanish is not very good. Today, I'd like to take you around the world in 20 minutes. My base of operations is in the US, but I'm going to start at the other end of the map in Kyoto, Japan, where I was living with a local Japanese family while I was a PhD student doing dissertational research there about 15 years ago. I knew even then that I would encounter cultural differences and misunderstandings, but they often popped up when I least expected them. On my first day in Kyoto, I went to a restaurant and I ordered a cup of green tea with a bit of sugar. The waiter responded by saying, "One does not put sugar in green tea." I know, I said, that I'm not supposed to, but I really like my tea sweet. Again he responded, "One does not put sugar in green tea." Yes, I know. I understand that the Japanese do not put sugar in their green tea, but I would really like to have some sugar in my green tea. Well, pretty soon the waiter started to have a discussion with the manager, and they got into some lengthy dialogue, and finally, after a while, the manager came over and said, "I am very sorry. We do not have sugar." All right, so I won't order the cup of tea, I'll order a cup of coffee. So I ordered a cup of coffee and the waiter brought it over. The same waiter, I might add. Resting on the saucer were 2 packets of sugar. So my failure to procure a cup of sweet green tea was not due to a simple misunderstanding, but was due to a fundamental difference in our ideas about choice. From my American perspectives, when a paying customer makes a reasonable request, then she has every right to have that preference met. The American way, to quote Burger King, is to have it your way. Because as Starbucks says, happiness is in your choices. Now, from the Japanese perspective, it was their duty to protect those who don't know any better, in this case, the ignorant gaijin, from making the wrong choice. The way I wanted my choice was inappropriate, according to Japanese standards. So they were doing their polite best to help me save face. Americans believe that they have reached some sort of pinnacle in the way they practice choice. They think that choice, as seen through the American lens, best fulfills an innate and universal desire for choice in all humans. And so it is the American duty to foist the gift of choice on those who might not know any better. Unfortunately, these beliefs are based on assumptions that don't always hold true in many countries, in many cultures. They don't even hold true often even within the borders of the US. I'd like to discuss some of these assumptions and the problems associated with them. As I do so, I hope you'll think about some of your own assumptions and how they were shaped by your backgrounds. First assumption. If a choice affects you, then you should be the one to make it. This is the only way to ensure that your preferences and your interests will be fully accounted for. This is essential for success. In America, the primary locus of choice is in the individual. People must choose for themselves, sometimes sticking to their guns regardless of what other people want or recommend. It's called being true to yourself. But do all individuals benefit from taking such an approach to choice? My colleague, Mark Lepper, and I decided to find out. We conducted a study with 7 to 9-year-old Asian and Anglo-American children in San Francisco, California. We divided these kids into 3 groups. When the first group arrived, they were greeted by an experimenter, Miss Smith. Miss Smith showed these children 6 different anagram puzzles, showed them 6 markers. They could choose which activity they would like to do. They could choose which marker they would use to jot down their answers. When the second group arrived, they too were greeted by Miss Smith. But this time, Miss Smith told them which anagrams to do and which markers to write their answers with. Now, when the third group arrived, they were told by Miss Smith that both the anagram task and the markers that they would be using today had already been pre-selected by their mothers. In reality, the children that were told, either by Miss Smith or their mothers, what to do, were actually given the very same activity which the children in the first group had earlierly chosen. This procedure ensured that the kids across the 3 groups all engaged in the same task. In this way, we could compare their performance. Such small differences in the way this activity was administered yielded striking differences in how well these kids performed. Anglo-American children, they did 2.5 times better when they got to choose as compared to when it was chosen for them. It didn't matter whether it was Miss Smith or their mothers. In fact, some of the kids got visibly embarrassed, even annoyed when they were told that their mothers had been asked. I remember there was this one girl named Mary, and when she was told that her mother had been asked, she expressed with that candid horror so characteristic of 7-year-olds, "You asked my mother?" In contrast, the Asian children did best when they believed what they were doing had been chosen by their mothers. Second best when they chose it for themselves, and least well when the activity had been chosen by Miss Smith. Their reaction to having their mothers pre-select their activity was strikingly different from that of the Anglo-Americans. Many of them wanted their assignments to be shared with their mothers. In fact, there was this one girl named Natsumi, very sweet. As she was walking out of the room, she went up to Miss Smith and started to tug on her skirt. "Could you please tell my mommy I did it just like she said?" In similar studies that have been done with Mexican-American children in the U.S., they find that Mexican children tend to look more like the Asians than like the Anglo-American children. The first generation children were strongly influenced by their immigrant parents' approach to choice. For them, choice was not just a way of defining and asserting the individual self, but a way to create community and harmony by deferring to the choices of those whom they most respect and trust. If they had a concept of being true to oneself, then it is likely that that self was composed not solely of one individual, but of a collective. Success was just as much about pleasing key figures as it is about satisfying one's own preferences. Or you might say that the individual's preferences are shaped by the preferences of important others. The assumption that we do best when we choose on our own only holds when there is a clean divide between that self and others. When in contrast, two or more individuals see their choices and their outcomes as intimately connected, they may amplify one another's success by turning choosing into a collective act. To insist that they choose independently might actually compromise both their performance and their relationships. And yet, that is exactly what the American paradigm demands. It leaves little room for interdependence or individual fallibility. It requires that everyone treat choice as a private and self-defining act. For those who have grown up in such a paradigm, it might be motivating. But it is a mistake to think that everyone thrives under the pressure of choosing alone. The second assumption that informs the American view of choice goes something like this. The more options there are, the more likely I am to make the best choices for myself. So bring it on, Walmart with 100,000 products, and Amazon with 27 million books, and Match.com with 15 million date possibilities. With so much to choose from, surely you will find the perfect match. Well, let's test this assumption by heading over to Eastern Europe, Poland, Russia, Ukraine. I conducted a series of interviews with people, residents of formerly communist countries that had all experienced the transition from communism to capitalism. And I asked them a whole bunch of questions about what were their ideas about choice, what did they expect from choice. In the process, I came by a revelation that came not from a specific question, but from a gesture of hospitality. During one of the interview sessions in Russia, as the interview session began, I offered the participants some sodas to drink, to have while we were meeting. One of the participants surprised me, took me off guard as I offered him the sodas. He said, "Oh, but it doesn't matter. It's all just soda. That's just one choice." Just one choice? I had Coke and Pepsi and Sprite, 7-Up, ginger ale. I mean, that seemed more like one choice. In my mind, I was offering him 7 choices. Curious about his response, though, after that I began to ask all the participants, as I offered them the same 7 sodas, how many choices are these? Again and again, they saw these 7 sodas not as 7 choices, but as one choice, soda or no soda. When I added juice and water to the mix, now they saw it as 3 choices: water, juice, and soda. Well, compare this to the diehard devotion of many Americans, not only to a particular flavor of soda pop, but a particular brand. Over the years, research has shown repeatedly that we can't actually tell the difference between Coke and Pepsi in blind taste tests. That doesn't stop us from swearing for one or the other. Of course, I think Coke is better. For modern Americans who are exposed to more options and more ads associated with those options than anyone else in the world, choice is just as much about who you are as it is about what the product is. Combine this with the assumption that more choice is always better, and you have a group of people for whom every little difference matters, so every choice matters. But for Eastern Europeans, the sudden availability of this wide array of options in the marketplace felt more like a deluge. They were flooded with choice before they had a chance to protest that they didn't know how to swim. When asked, what words or images do you associate with choice? Gregors from Warsaw said, for me it is fear. There are some dilemmas, you see. I am used to no choice. Bodin from Kiev, when asked to comment about how he felt about the new consumer marketplace, said, there is too much. We don't need everything that is there. A sociologist from the Poland's Survey Institute said, the older generation went from no choice to choice all around them. They were never given the chance to learn how to react. As a result, they regard all these choices with suspicion and ambivalence. And a young man, Tomás, said, I do not need 10 kinds of chewing gum. I don't mean to say there should be no choice, but many of these choices are quite artificial. In reality, many choices are between things that are not much different. The value of choice depends on our ability to perceive differences between the options. If you think about it, as Americans, they train their whole lives to play spot the difference. They practice this from such an early age that they have come to believe that everyone must be born with this ability. But although we are all born with an innate desire for choice, we don't all see choice in the same places or to the same extent. When one cannot see how one choice is unlike another, and when there are too many choices to compare and contrast, the process of choosing becomes confusing and frustrating. Instead of making better choices, we grow overwhelmed by choice, even afraid of it. Choice no longer offers us opportunity, but imposes constraints. It's no longer a marker of liberation, but of suffocation by meaningless minutiae. In other words, choice can develop into the very opposite of everything it represents in America when it is thrust upon those who are insufficiently prepared for it. But it is not only other people in other places who are feeling the increasing pressure of more choice. Americans themselves are discovering that limitless choice sounds better in theory than in practice. We all have physical, mental, and emotional limitations that make it impossible for us to process every single choice in the grocery store, let alone over the course of our lives. In my own studies, I've found repeatedly that whenever people are given 10 or more choices, they make worse choices, whether it be consumer products, dating choices, investment choices, healthcare choices. Yet still, many of us believe we should make our own choices and that we should seek out even more choice. This leads me to the third and perhaps most problematic assumption. You must never say no to choice. To examine this assumption, I'm going to head back to the U.S., then cross the Atlantic and go to France. Right outside Chicago, a young couple, Susan and Daniel Mitchell, were about to have a baby, their first one. They had already named her Barbara after her grandmother. When Susan was 7 months pregnant, she started to experience contractions one night and was rushed to the emergency room. They performed a cesarean, but Barbara suffered cerebral anoxia, a loss of oxygen to the brain. 2 days later, the doctors came to the Mitchells and gave them a choice. They could either remove Barbara off of life support right now, in which case she would die within hours. Or they could keep her on life support, in which case she might still die within a matter of days. If she didn't, she would remain in a permanent vegetative state, never able to walk, talk, or interact with others. Devastated with this news, they wondered what they should choose. What do? What does any parent do in such a circumstance? My colleagues, Simona Botti, Christina Orfali, and I interviewed parents in just these tragic situations, both in the United States and in France. In all cases, the life support was removed and the infants died. But there was one critical difference. In France, the doctor decided when the plug would be pulled. In the U.S., the final decision rested with the parents. We wondered whether this difference would affect the parents' ability to cope with their tragic loss. We found that it did. Even up to a year later, the American parents expressed much more negative emotions than did their French counterparts. French parents were much more likely to say things like, "Noah was here for so little time, but he taught us so much. He gave us a new perspective on life." By contrast, American parents said things like, "I keep thinking to myself, what if? What if?" Another parent said, "How did they get me to do that? I feel as if I was being tortured." Yet another parent said, "I feel as if I played a role in an execution." But when these parents were asked if they would rather have had the doctor make the choice instead, they all said no. They all said no, even though having made that choice left them feeling trapped, guilty, and in many cases clinically depressed. These parents could not contemplate turning the choice over to someone else, because to do so would have gone against everything they had been taught and everything they had come to believe about the power and purpose of choice. In her essay, The White Album, the poet Joan Didion writes, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live. We interpret what we see. Select the most workable from the multiple choices. We live entirely by the imposition of the narrative line upon disparate images, by the ideas with which we learn to freeze the shifting phantasmagoria, which is our actual experience. The story Americans tell, the story upon which the American dream depends, is the story of limitless choice. This narrative promises so much: freedom, happiness, success. It lays the world at your feet and says you can have anything, everything. It's a great story. And so it's understandable why they would be reluctant to revise it. But when you take a close look, you start to see the holes, and you start to see that this story can be told in many other ways. So often, Americans tend to disseminate their ideas of choice, believing that they will be or ought to be welcomed with open hearts and minds. But the history books and the daily news tell us that it doesn't always work out that way. The phantasmagoria, the actual experience that we try to organize and understand through narrative, varies from place to place. No single narrative meets the needs of everyone, everywhere. Moreover, Americans themselves can benefit from incorporating new perspectives into their own narrative that has been driving their choices for so long. The American poet Robert Frost once said, "It is poetry that is lost in translation." This suggests that everything that is beautiful and moving, and that everything that gives us a new way to see, cannot be communicated to those who speak different languages. But Joseph Brodsky, who once described himself as a Jew, Russian poet, English essayist, said that it is poetry that is gained in translation, suggesting that translation can be a creative and a transformative act through which new possibilities are born. When it comes to choice, I think there is more to be gained by encouraging the translation of the different narratives. Instead of replacing one narrative with another, we can learn from and revel in the many versions that exist and the many that have yet to be written. No matter where we're from and what our narrative is, it is our responsibility to open ourselves up to a wider range, to what choice can be and what it can represent. And this does not lead to a paralyzing moral relativism, but rather it teaches us how and when to act. It brings us that much closer to realizing the full potential of choice, to inspiring the hope and achieving the freedom that choice promises but doesn't always deliver. If we learn to speak to one another in translation, then we can begin to see choice in all its strangeness, complexity, and compelling beauty. Thank you very much.